He is just been flailing. Bush has, and Commissioner Bush, I think, has missed so many opportunities to really step up and sort of burnish the Bush dynasty rather than be sort of the end of it. If you think about where the Bush dynasty started with his grandfather, George H.W. Bush in Houston, his very first job in politics really was being the GOP county chairman in Houston. And if you think about where he's from in Houston, the west side of the city is often talked about as the cradle of the establishment Republican Party in the United States. It's the kind of Republicans who are pro-business for sure, pro-immigration, pro-trade, that sort of stuff. They're for low taxes and a predictable regulatory environment and all that. But they'd be the same people who would attend a fundraiser for Planned Parenthood. And there are still some like that in that area. And some of those same Republicans would be the ones who helped Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher win her seat, right? That they were sort of offended by the person she beat, which is the former Congressman John Culberson, who I know you're familiar with. And so that has all shifted a lot. I was told that Commissioner Bush met with former President Trump twice. And the first meeting that they had was simply to ask for the endorsement in the race. And that, of course, didn't happen. Trump endorsed Paxton. And then the second meeting that I was told about between Bush and Trump was to ask this question, because I was told that Jeb, ! Jeb wanted to Jeb wanted to know the degree to which Trump was really going to get involved in the race. Is he just endorsing Paxton and that's it? Or was he going to come to Texas and rally for Paxton, cut TV commercials for him and all that sort of stuff, be active on social media, back when he was able to do that and all of that. And when Bush met with Trump to ask that question, and Bush, apparently said something like, look, I know that you're endorsing Ken Paxton. I respect that and everything. But we just have this question, because we want to know exactly how we should run our campaign. And I'm told that Trump didn't really answer that question. But what he said was, look, I don't have any problem with you. I like you. But Ken Paxton is the only attorney general in the whole country who would file that lawsuit for me to try to overturn the election results in some other states. And so I'm with Ken 100%. Instead of trying to be some kind of other candidate, and you guys have been, covering these other races in other states, instead of trying to be an anti-Trump candidate or something other than Trump candidate, which I think the second of those would be smarter, right? We've seen anti-Trump candidates just go down in flames in most places, but to try to be something different, instead of doing that, Bush instead just tried to lean into also being Trumpy, like has happened in these other races, like the J.D. Vance race in Ohio, where you have all these people who are trying to be the most Trumpy candidate, and only one of them has the actual endorsement. And sometimes that goes one way, sometimes it goes another way. But instead of trying to be a real alternative, Bush just leaned into trying to be the Trump candidate as well. So the big example on that was at the campaign kickoff right here in Austin for George P. Bush for Attorney General. He was handing out koozies. I wish I had one here, I'd show you, but he was handing out beer koozies that on one side said, George P. Bush for Texas Attorney General with the Texas flag, standard stuff. And on the other side, it had an image of George P. Bush with President Trump shaking hands somewhere at an event, I think an event in Houston. And under the image, it had a quote from Trump that said, "This is the Bush that got it right. This is the Bush that likes me. I like him." Donald Trump.
Do you think Republicans are going to start building like churches with stained glass windows of Donald Trump on them? Like, what? Trump, that is just weird.
I tweeted out the image of that koozie, and I do think, and I've got a decent little following on Twitter, I do think that it was remarkable for a few reasons. Number one, I think it's the most viewed thing I've ever put out on social media. So it's something like 6 million views or something for this koozie. And I had all these national media outlets, reaching out to me to ask this question: is that real? Because what he was doing with this campaign merchandise is throwing the whole Bush dynasty under the bus. There have been some Republicans that have been critical of Ken Paxton for saying that conservatives need to band together to end the Bush dynasty. That's in some of Paxton's campaign messages. Some Republicans have said, no, this should be about issues, should be about our resumes and all of that for the candidates. But those people should remember, it was George P. Bush who first trashed the Bush dynasty by making that one of his key campaign messages, is that all the other Bushes are wrong about Trump, and I'm the one that's right.
Well, it sounds like
in the meantime, he's just been trashed by the Trump base for
that basically George P. Bush is woke and he won't stop school districts from teaching critical race theory, and that he's woke. And like, what is more woke than like hating your ancestors and, turning your back on, former presidents? Like it sounds like George P. Bush just super woke and should run as progressive maybe.
With P, I mean, he squandered so many chances to do really good things. He's in the office he's in now. Is land commissioner. He heads up the general land office of Texas, and he likes to joke at campaign events that a lot of his job is explaining to voters what the land office even does. Some critics have said if he would put as much energy into actually doing the job, then people wouldn't have to have it explained to them. The land office, I know the land office is very important. They do a few things that are key in this state. For example, they help administer relief funds for disasters like Hurricane Harvey, which was back in 2017. There are still a lot of people who are upset years later about the way all that unfolded. I've covered a lot of natural disasters in Texas because we get all of them. There's always something trying to kill you in Texas, whether it's a hurricane or a rattlesnake or a wildfire or whatever. 110-degree temperatures. If you
driver on the Katy Parkway.
Yes, people trying to merge onto the freeway, right? Yeah. All of that. And the person trying to drive is either going to kill you by running into you or shooting you on the freeway, right? So it's the Wild West in a lot of ways. So y'all come, and check out Texas. But look, the political fallout from a disaster like Hurricane Harvey, it doesn't just happen in the days and weeks after the disaster. It happens in the months and years after the disaster, when people don't feel like they have been made whole and that the government hasn't done enough to help them. One of the things the land office was charged with is helping to administer, the rebuilding of homes along the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Harvey. And I did the math on this. It's something like 1/5 of the electorate in a GOP primary lives in the counties that were directly impacted by Hurricane Harvey. So that's strike one against Commissioner Bush. The other thing that he has really bungled in the estimation of conservatives is something that's sort of sacred. You mentioned stained glass.
Yeah.
We have sort of a shrine to Texas and to our independence that he's in charge of. You might have heard of it. It's called the Alamo. The land office oversees it in San Antonio. And the way that historic site is governed is a real mess. It's a disaster because the land office is involved, so state government, as well as the city government of San Antonio, where it is. And there's also a nonprofit that's involved in the governance of how everything is handled there. And Commissioner Bush put forward a plan to, quote unquote, reimagine the Alamo, which of course Ken Paxton turned into basically a CRT thing, or it's a liberal woke plan to, change it. And actually, if you look at what Commissioner Bush was planning there, what he wanted to do was actually a pretty reasonable idea to kind of give people more of a sense of exactly what all happened at the Alamo, at the Battle of the Alamo, and all of the things surrounding the timeline of the one day. That's around here. A lot of folks like to just focus on the one day when there was the big battle at the Alamo, the siege at the Alamo, but there's a lot more to the history, and a lot of folks just don't want to hear about that. And there was a book out this past year that's pretty controversial called Forget the Alamo, written by some friends of mine, Chris Tomlinson over at the Houston Chronicle, and Jason Stanford, who's a Democrat here in Austin. But that's something that the conservative grassroots was very upset about. You remember all these arguments about preserving our monuments, quote unquote, around the country as some of these statues were coming down.
War statues. And
years ago, I went to a few campaign events with the former land commissioner. He authored the concealed carry law originally when he was a state senator. And this was at the time that Patterson was challenging George P. Bush for the land office. And the former commissioner had his whole spiel for the crowd at these GOP events about what the land commissioner does. And Patterson had actually supported George P. Bush when he first ran for that office, and then later said he had misgivings because of how bad a job he was doing. That's the way he put it. Well, after Patterson would speak and he'd open it up for questions with these GOP voters, the first thing they would ask about was the Alamo and, quote, preserving our monuments. So there's strike two against George P. Bush as far as the GOP electorate in the state who have just not been impressed with him. And I do think that in a general election, the Bush name is probably still a net positive in Texas, but in a primary, it's been trashed now by former President Trump and others. And now Paxton is, just latching onto that by saying it's time to end the Bush dynasty, which I do think is going to happen on Tuesday.